A small number of coordinated raids targeting undocumented immigrants took place over the weekend. Sweeping raids were reportedly set to take place, but according to DHS officials, plans for the operation were changed because of tips to the communities.
Yeah, in part from the president. Ahead of those raids, the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals overturned a nationwide injunction on the distribution of Department of Justice policing grants. So what that means is that now DOJ can give preferential treatment to cities that abide by federal immigration laws. So a hit to sanctuary cities. Here to discuss all of this more in depth is former acting director of ICE under President Obama, John Sandweg. He also served as general counsel for the Department of Homeland Security, acting general counsel, I think that is supposed to say. Great to see you, John. We're glad to have you. First, let me get your reaction to the kind of very limited raids that occurred over the weekend. What do you think happened here, having been on the inside, that caused ICE to change their plans?
I'm not sure they were ever planned in the manner in which the public thought they were going to be planned. It would take a tremendous amount of resources for ICE to do these kind of sweeping raids. I think a lot of this was started with the president's tweet about a million, apprehending a million individuals. Yeah, ICE has no capacity. Annually, they arrest about 600,000 people annually. So I think that was always probably going to be what it would appear to be more limited. I also think, though, that all the public discourse about it really did probably influence the agency's planning a bit, in the sense that, one, you have real serious officer safety issues when you're talking about an operation and telling the public officers going to be out making arrests. And two, is it just dramatically diminishes the effectiveness of the operation, because the people who you're targeting are not going to be there when because they have advance warning that ICE is coming.
John, I also want to get your reaction. Breaking news this morning that the Trump administration is moving to publish a new regulation from the Department of Homeland Security that would effectively bar asylum for Central Americans. What the rule says is that if you pass through another country, then you are not allowed to seek asylum in the United States. Explain the process behind the publishing of this rule and the legal scrutiny it's likely to face.
Well, the challenge we're facing at the border right now really isn't a number of people. We've handled more people with a far fewer resources at the border. The problem is that because people are making asylum claims, it puts a lot of drain on different parts of the system. So the immigration courts and the USCIS asylum adjudication officers. So the administration is trying to eliminate that by basically barring Central American asylum seekers from being able to access asylum, requiring them to make an asylum claim in Mexico. Whether, the first question is this going to stand up in court? And I think that's an open question. Obviously, I think plaintiffs have been very successful in challenging the administration's policies. But two, I'm not entirely sure it's going to solve the problem. There are other laws that also come into play, and they're kind of inside baseball kind of issues, like withholding or removal in the Convention Against Torture. So there are other claims that the immigrants can make that still require some judicial process. I'm not entirely sure it's going to be an immediate cure-all. But it does further the administration's goal. And look, what this really does is it basically is another way around getting a safe third country agreement with Mexico.
Right.
I think, as we know, the administration was really pushing hard to get Mexico to say, hey, we will provide asylum hearings for all the Central Americans who come up through Mexico to the United States. Mexico, understandably, is very reluctant of doing that because it would be hundreds of thousands of claims. But by kind of implementing this rule, I think what the administration hopes is they can force the Central Americans and legally push them back into Mexico and force them to make a claim in Mexico itself.
Before we evaluate the merits of this thing itself, do you think it's a crisis? Is it a crisis at the border right now?
I think it's a crisis that we can fix easily, and that's what frustrates me. Certainly, it's a humanitarian crisis. This is the price we pay for being the United States, for having a great economy and for having great, protections of freedom, basically. We're going to draw people to come to this country looking for a better life. The problem is, though, we can handle it. We just haven't resourced ourselves accordingly. We continue to treat this as a security issue and try to use deterrence and other things, but what we fail to do is plus up the immigration judges. So the administration's rightfully frustrated, and I think the public's frustrated when they look at it and say, hey, we have 1 million pending cases and only 350 judges. I just don't understand why we haven't been plussing up the number of judges, plussing up the number of USCIS officers who process these claims. The issue really hasn't been the volume of people, it's just the time it takes to go through the process. We control that and we can just resource it appropriately. The problem is solved.
John, we recently learned about a Facebook group that included a large number of acting and former CBP officers with some just truly horrific, racist, awful, sexist, just terrible stuff in it. Were you surprised by that? What was your response?
Well, listen, I've spent a lot of time with the Border Patrol. especially down at the border. I have a lot of respect for the Border Patrol agents. I think they've been dealt a very unfair hand here. They are designed and built to go after bad guys trying to sneak into the country. That's what they're resourced for. That's what they're trained for. That's what they're tasked for. But because we haven't adequately funded those aspects of the system I was just mentioning, we're now forcing them to be the detainers of children, the detainers of large groups of families with equipment and and facilities that were never designed to house children. They've really been dealt an unwinnable hand here. So there's a small, very, very small, in my experience, very small percentage of them who embarrass the agency with those tasks. They're not representative though of the majority of the agency. And I really feel bad for ICE and CBP here because I think that the manner in which we're currently trying to use them has damaged their reputation in a way that's going to be very hard and take a very long time for them to overcome, and really is not representative of the role and the men and women who are at ICE and CBP.
But hasn't the job fundamentally changed because the nature of the immigrants who are coming across have changed? Like maybe you signed up to be a badass going out and getting the bad guys in the desert, but that's not necessarily who's coming across as much now.
It is 100% changed. And I'll tell you that some of that element is still coming across, of course.
Of course.
We're taking advantage of the
certainly.
situation. But the bottom line here is this: we're asking them to do things they are not designed to do. It's not their responsibility. The law, we've always had laws in place to deal with with asylum seekers. We just haven't resourced it appropriately. But it's not Border Patrol is supposed to be housing children. It's HHS. HHS can't because we haven't funded them, so they're overwhelmed. Backlogs have formed, and there has to be somewhere to house the kids.
Why do we have to detain children?
We shouldn't detain children. We should hold the children very briefly to process them, get their biometrics, put them in the system, and not detain them. And the law doesn't allow us to detain them. The problem is when you have so few HHS officers and a refusal to adequately fund them, that backlogs form. And look, no one wants to detain the kids. Certainly, in my experience, the last thing CBP and ICE does not detain children, but the last thing ICE wants to do is detain children. But the problem is HHS has to place them. There's not enough officers at HHS, Health and Human Services, to place the kids, so these backlogs have formed. And that's what I'm saying. We've really put Border Patrol and ICE in an unwinnable position by asking them to do things that they're not supposed to do.
Are you offended by Democratic calls and accusations that ICE is a criminal organization?
Yeah, listen, I think that unfortunately there's a lot of frustration on both sides, right? There's people on the right who want to see much more aggressive, enforcement of our immigration laws, but don't understand the challenges we face. The reality is there's no way of enforcing our way out of the system. It's like the idea we're going to arrest 1 million people.
Right.
ICE can remove
it's impossible.
It's impossible. ICE can remove about 200,000. There are 11.5 million in the country unlawfully. The immigration courts have 1 million cases back, pending with 350 judges. So I get where that frustration comes from. On the left, there's also this frustration, though, obviously with the administration's policies. I think it's very unfair to take that out on ICE. ICE, my experience, ICE, wants to focus on public safety. And this idea that we shouldn't, if you start looking at some of the people that ICE is focused on and removes, now that's changed a bit. And I completely disagree with the administration's policies of removing the focus on convicted criminals. But if you look at it during the Obama years, when there's a lot of criticism as well, 97% of the people we removed were convicted criminals. And if you look at who those people are, I would think that any reasonable American would agree that, hey, some of these individuals have no right to be in the United States. We have to have some immigration enforcement. And so you get these calls where they taint ICE or they taint CBP. And this is what I'm referencing earlier. When CBP and ICE are forced to do things they're not designed to do, house children, or detain these families, people that really don't need detention, that we could still have tough enforcement against and not detain. When you ask them to do those things, you get these calls from the left, and it just puts them in an impossible position, damages reputation. And look, ICE does a lot of stuff related to national security, stopping child exploitation, incredible stuff that I think the majority of the public would be overwhelmingly in favor of. The problem here, though, is that now ICE is forever tainted in CBP as these rogue agencies that are detaining and persecuting kids.
How do you compare the detention conditions under this president versus President Obama?
Well, they're much worse right now. I don't say that. Look, I don't think that's a function of CBP or ICE, or candidly, even the administration saying let's make detention as miserable as possible for these individuals. They are stuck with the detaining populations that just simply weren't designed to be detained. Look, I think we ought to look very hard at immigration detention. We have this kind of assumption that everybody should be detained in immigration. Nobody really looks at that. There are perfectly easy ways of managing risk, flight risk, and these people don't pose any public safety risk. Where we don't have to detain them.
How can you say that with such confidence?
Well, we've done studies. We had run pilot programs where we did what we call alternatives to detention. And we had something like 98% compliance rate. It could involve an ankle bracelet. It involves monitoring. I'm not saying you just let go. You're going to be checking in with an ICE agent. You're probably going to be subject to electronic monitoring.
How is that not a draw factor, though? Which is if you know you're going to be able to come here and you're going to be free in the United States of America, everybody in Guatemala is going to move to the United States.
If there's any draw factor, what I think it is, it's not the fact that you're going to be free. Now, let's be honest too. This administration is releasing these individuals too.
Yes, of course. It's a catastrophe of
so
law.
we face really two choices right now. One is to build something like 200,000 or 300,000 beds, which will cost us. I mean, we're already spending billions of dollars on detention. So now we're going to spend billions and billions more. But the issue really is not the detention. It's not the freedom. The issue, if there's any draw at all, it's the amount of time you're legally allowed to remain in the United States while your court case moves through the court system.
Right.
And with only 350 judges, it's right now 3 to 4 years. Right. That's what needs to be fixed. But you could take that detention money, a fraction of the detention money, double or even triple the immigration courts, shorten that length of time dramatically, and with proper electronic monitoring, you fail to appear in court, guess what? ICE will go get you. You commit a crime while you're released, ICE will go get you. The criminal justice system operates this way, where I'm not sure the specific number, but only a certain percentage of people charged with crimes in this country are detained prior to trial. Yet in the immigration context, we kind of adopt this approach without really thinking it through, that 100% of the people should be detained, when we have very effective and much cheaper means of ensuring they appear, and then we could divert those resources to the court system, thus solving the actual problem, which is the time.
Makes sense to me. John, always great to have you.
Thank
you, sir. Next on Rising, the president of the United Mine Workers of America invites the Dems to his house.
With the broad field of Democratic candidates, he wants to make sure the party still represents working class citizens. He'll tell us how many have responded and who has been the most convincing. That when Rising continues.